The smell of Old Spice cologne still makes my stomach turn. 43 years after Harold first sprayed it on his neck before our first date. 61 years after I said I do in that little Baptist church on Maple Street. And 3 months after I found the letters hidden under his pillow. Letters that proved everything I believed about our love was a lie. I'm Lorraine Foster. I'm 86 years old. And I'm about to tell you something that will change how you look at the person sleeping next to you tonight. It started with a hiccup. Not mine. His. Harold had been having these little episodes for weeks. Tiny, jerky movements in his sleep that would wake me up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., sometimes 4 times a night. The doctor said it was normal for a man his age, 89, with a pacemaker and arthritis in both knees. Just keep an eye on him, Mrs. Foster, Dr. Martinez had said. Make sure he's comfortable. So I did what any wife of 61 years would do. I fluffed his pillow. I adjusted his blanket. I made sure his water glass was full and his reading glasses were within reach on the nightstand. And on the morning of March 15th, when I lifted his pillow to fluff it properly, something crinkled underneath. Paper. Folded, hidden. My first thought was medication instructions. Harold was terrible about following doctor's orders, and I figured maybe he'd stash some prescription notes under there so he wouldn't forget. But when I unfolded that first piece of paper, the handwriting wasn't Dr. Martinez's. It was a woman's, curvy letters in blue ink, and it started with 2 words that made my blood freeze. My darling. My darling Harold, I can't stop thinking about last Tuesday. The way you held me in your car after lunch at Morrison's cafeteria. The way you whispered that you wished things were different. I know this is complicated, but I need you to know what we have is real. More real than anything I've ever felt. I'll be waiting for your call. All my love, Dorothy. Dorothy Jenkins. Our neighbor for 22 years, the woman who brought us casseroles when I had my hip surgery, the woman who watched our house when we visited our daughter in Phoenix, the woman who sat in the pew behind us every Sunday at First Baptist, right next to her husband Frank. I sat on the edge of that bed, the same bed where Harold and I had shared 61 years of marriage, and I felt something inside me crack, not break. Crack, like ice on a frozen pond when the first warm day comes. But I didn't stop reading. I couldn't. There were 17 letters total, 17 pieces of evidence that my husband of 6 decades had been living a double life. The earliest one was dated February 1983, 40 years ago. I was 46 then, still working at the county clerk's office, still believing that Harold's Tuesday golf games and Wednesday evening church meetings were exactly what he said they were. Harold's sweetheart, another letter read, I know you feel guilty about Lorraine, but you have to understand. We deserve this happiness. We've both given so much to other people. Isn't it time we gave something to ourselves? Meet me Thursday at the usual place. I'll bring the picnic lunch. Love always, Dorothy. The usual place. They had a usual place. I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you're still here listening to an old woman's heartbreak, maybe you understand what I'm talking about. Most people would have stopped reading. Most people would have confronted him right then and there. But something tells me you're the kind of person who needs to know the whole truth, no matter how much it hurts. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest of this story, because it gets worse before it gets better. I kept reading, letter after letter after letter. 40 years of my darling, and I miss you, and when can we be together again? 40 years of secret meetings and stolen moments and lies. So many lies. In 1987, when I thought Harold was helping his brother fix his roof, he was actually spending the weekend with Dorothy at a cabin near Lake Texoma. In 1993, when he told me he needed to stay late at the hardware store for inventory, He was having dinner with her at that little Italian place on the other side of town. In 2001, when I was home taking care of my mother during her final illness, he was taking Dorothy to see Titanic at the movie theater. The same movie he told me was too long and too sad when I asked him to take me. 40 years of Tuesday golf games that weren't golf games. 40 years of Wednesday evening meetings that weren't meetings. 40 years of running errands that weren't errands. 40 years of me making his favorite pot roast every Sunday, ironing his shirts every Monday, sitting beside him in church every week, holding his hand during prayers, believing we were partners in this thing called marriage. 40 years of me sleeping alone while he dreamed of another woman. The worst letter was dated just 6 months ago, September 2023. Harold's handwriting was shakier by then. The arthritis had gotten into his fingers, but the words were clear enough. Dorothy, my love, it said, I know we're both getting older. I know Frank's getting suspicious, and I know Lorraine deserves better than what I've given her. But I can't imagine my life without you in it. These past 40 years, you've been my real companion, my true love. Lorraine is a good woman, but what we have is different. What we have is choice, not obligation. I choose you, Dorothy. I've always chosen you, Harold. Choice, not obligation. That's what our 61-year marriage was to him, obligation. I sat there in our bedroom, the bedroom where we'd raised 2 children, where we'd held each other through my father's death and his mother's stroke, where we'd made love and made plans and made a life together, and I realized I'd been married to a stranger. No, that's not right. I'd been married to a man who was living his real life with someone else. I was just the woman who cooked his meals and washed his clothes and shared his bed while he counted the hours until he could be with the woman he actually loved. Someone once told me there are rules that change after 60. One of them says that the person you trust most after 60 is the most dangerous. I learned that the hard way. Harold wasn't just cheating on me, he was stealing from me. Stealing my time, my trust, my reality. That rule is part of something called the 60-year rule. If you want to know what those other rules are, it's in the description below this video. By the time I finished reading all 17 letters, it was past noon. Harold was still in the living room, watching his westerns on TV. Same routine he'd had for years. Wake up at 7, coffee and toast, read the newspaper, watch Gunsmoke reruns until lunch, then a nap, then dinner, then more TV until bedtime. Except now I knew that twice a week, sometimes 3 times, he broke that routine. Now I knew that when he told me he was going to Home Depot, he was really going to see Dorothy. When he said he was visiting his cousin in Tulsa, he was really spending the night with the woman who signed her letters, Your Devoted Heart. I folded those letters back up, put them exactly where I found them, fluffed his pillow like nothing had happened, and I went to the kitchen to make lunch. Tuna salad sandwiches, his favorite. I stood at the counter, mixing mayonnaise with chunks of tuna, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Rage. Pure, clean rage. Not the quick anger that flares up when someone cuts you off in traffic. Not the frustration of a bad day or a broken appliance. This was different. This was the rage of a woman who just discovered that her entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies. Lunch is ready, Harold, I called. He shuffled into the kitchen, same as always, kissed my cheek, same as always, said, smells good, honey, same as always, except now I knew it was all an act. How was your morning? He asked, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. The same chair he'd sat in for 30 years, in the same spot where he'd probably planned his secret meetings with Dorothy. Fine, I said. Just fine. I watched him eat that sandwich, watched him chew and swallow and smile at me like he had 1,000,000 times before. And I thought about all the meals I'd made for him, all the birthday cakes and anniversary dinners and holiday feasts, all the times I'd gotten up early to pack him a lunch for work, all the times I'd waited up late when he said he'd be home by 9 and didn't walk through the door until 11. You're quiet today, he said. Everything all right? Everything's fine, Harold. But everything wasn't fine. Everything was broken, shattered, destroyed. That afternoon, while Harold napped in his recliner, I did something I'd never done in 61 years of marriage. I went through his things. Really went through them. I checked his wallet, his coat pockets, his desk drawers. I looked through his address book and his old appointment calendars. I searched his dresser and his closet, and even the glove compartment of his Buick. I found more evidence, a restaurant receipt from Valentine's Day. But we'd stayed home that night, watched TV, and shared a box of chocolates. A ticket stub from a movie I'd never seen. A small velvet jewelry box hidden behind his old work boots with a silver bracelet inside. A bracelet I'd never worn. 40 years of secret gifts for his secret love. That evening I cooked his favorite dinner, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. I set the table with our good china, the set we'd gotten for our wedding. I even lit the candles we usually save for special occasions. What's all this for? Harold asked when he saw the fancy setup. Can a wife make a nice dinner for her husband? I said. He smiled, that same crooked smile that had charmed me at the church social in 1962. The same smile he'd given me on our wedding day when I walked down the aisle in my mother's dress. The same smile that had meant everything to me for 6 decades. Now it just looked like another lie. We ate in relative quiet. Harold complimented the meatloaf, asked about my day, mentioned that he might need to run some errands tomorrow. Errands. I knew what that meant now. Where are you going? I asked. Oh, just around town. Hardware store, maybe the bank. Nothing exciting. Nothing exciting, except for the part where he'd be holding hands with Dorothy Jenkins while I stayed home and cleaned our house. After dinner, we watched the news together on the couch. Same routine we'd had for years. Harold in his spot on the right, me on the left, sharing the ottoman for our feet. During commercials, he'd reach over and pat my hand. Love you, Lorraine, he'd say. Love you, Lorraine. Words he'd said thousands of times over the decades. Words I'd treasured and believed and built my life around. Words that meant nothing. That night, lying next to him in the dark, I listened to his breathing. Slow and steady, occasionally interrupted by those little hiccups that had started this whole discovery. He was peaceful, content, probably dreaming about Dorothy. I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of 40 years of deception. 40 years of living with a man who was pretending to love me while actually loving someone else. 40 years of being the consolation prize in my own marriage. And that's when I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. Everything I learned about trust, about betrayal, about the lies we tell ourselves to avoid facing hard truths. It's all in something called the 60-year rule. 9 rules that explain exactly why everything I believed about marriage and loyalty was wrong after 60. It changed how I see my relationships, my worth, my future, everything. After living this nightmare, I found those rules, and they saved me. The link is right below this video. Don't wait as long as I did to discover them. The next morning I made Harold his coffee and toast, same as always. But instead of sitting at the table with him, I stood by the kitchen window, looking out at Dorothy's house across the street. She was watering her flowers, same as always. "I need to tell you something, Harold," I said. He looked up from his newspaper. "What's that, honey?" "I know about Dorothy." The newspaper crinkled in his hands. His coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. And for the first time in 40 years, Harold Foster had nothing to say. "I found the letters," I continued. "All of them. 40 years' worth." He set down his cup, folded the newspaper, looked at me with eyes I'd never seen before. Scared eyes. Guilty eyes. "Lorraine, Don't," I said. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. Don't tell me it didn't mean anything. Don't tell me you love me, because I read what you wrote to her. I know what I really am to you." He sat there in silence. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, Dorothy Jenkins kept watering her flowers. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. "Since yesterday morning." "What are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What does an 86-year-old woman do when she discovers that her entire marriage has been a lie? What do you do when the man you've loved for 61 years has been saving his real love for someone else? I looked at Harold, really looked at him, and I saw a stranger. An old man who'd wasted 40 years of my life. An old man who'd stolen my truth and given me lies in return. "I'm going to live," I said. "For the first time in 40 years, I'm going to live my own life instead of yours." 3 weeks later, I moved out of the house we'd shared for 30 years. Not to punish Harold. Punishment requires caring, and I'd run out of that. I moved out to save myself, to give myself whatever years I have left as Lorraine Foster, not as Harold Foster's obligation wife. I rented a little apartment on the other side of town. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a tiny kitchen with a window that faces east so I can watch the sunrise. I furnished it with things I actually liked instead of things that matched Harold's preferences. I painted the walls yellow, a color he'd always said was too bright. I'm 86 years old, and I'm learning to live alone for the first time in my adult life. Learning to cook for one person. Learning to make decisions without considering what Harold would want. Learning that I actually like jazz music and spicy food and staying up late to read romance novels. Learning that I'm not just an obligation to be managed. Dorothy sent me a letter 2 months ago. A real letter, not hidden under anyone's pillow. She apologized for the affair, said she'd ended things with Harold after our confrontation, said she hoped someday I could forgive her. I wrote back, 1 sentence, "You can have him." Because that's the truth I learned too late. Dorothy didn't steal my husband. She saved me from wasting any more years on a man who never chose me in the first place. Harold calls sometimes, usually around dinner time when he's sitting alone in the kitchen where I used to cook his meals. He asks when I'm coming home. He says he misses me. He says he loves me. I hang up. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. You can't miss someone you never actually saw. You can't love someone you spent 40 years lying to. I'm 86 years old and I'm finally free. Free from the smell of Old Spice cologne. Free from wondering why my husband seemed distant sometimes, why he was always running errands, why he never looked at me the way he looked at other women. Free from living a lie disguised as love. If you're listening to this and something in your gut is telling you that your own marriage isn't what you think it is, trust that feeling. Trust it before you waste 40 years like I did. Trust it before you wake up at 86 years old and realize you've been living someone else's leftover life. The person sleeping next to you tonight, do they choose you, or are you just their obligation? Do they light up when they see you, or do they save that light for someone else? You deserve to be someone's first choice, not their consolation prize. You deserve to be loved completely, not loved around the edges while they give their heart to someone else. Take it from an 86-year-old woman who learned this lesson 40 years too late. Your silence is not golden. Your patience is not virtue. Your willingness to settle for crumbs is not love. It's just fear wearing a prettier dress. I'm Lorraine Foster. I'm 86 years old. I found the proof under his pillow, and for the first time in 40 years, I'm sleeping peacefully at night.